So good morning or afternoon, wherever you are around the country. Welcome to our webinar today entitled Building Community Water Literacy. My name is Chris Manning from Water Sensitive Cities Australia, and I'll be your host for today. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Bindal people of Thulgari Wadja, which is in Townsville, south of the Ross River, on whose land that I'm on today. But on behalf of everyone in the room today, I'd also like to acknowledge the many First Nations people and their land from across Australia who have and continue to play a key role in water resource management and stewardship. I pay my respects on behalf of everyone on this call to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today we've got a webinar, the last one in our series for 2024, Building Community Water Literacy. It's been a project that's been ongoing for a little while, so we've unfortunately had to reschedule the webinar a couple of times. So thanks for those people who registered and then re-registered, etc. And we thank you for your patience. But we're really keen to and pleased to be able to provide some information about where we've got to with the project. So we've been developing and trialling some messages and mechanisms for improving water literacy, and we've run a couple of pilots in Perth and Melbourne. But before I go any further, I'd also like to do a thank you to all our partners and collaborators. In WA, we've had Water Corporation, Department of Water, Environment Regulation, and Department of Biodiversity Conservation and Attractions help guide us with this project. And in Victoria, we've had Southeast Water, Melbourne Water, and Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, as well as involvement from Water Services Association of Australia. So thanks to those partners and collaborators, they've been very helpful in helping us to get to where we are today. So today we've got two presentations. We've got Dr. Kien Nguyen Trung from Water Sensitive Cities Australia, and he'll be leading off today talking about the research and synthesising that research into a guideline. And then Dr. Lucy Richardson will be talking about testing that guideline in the pilots in both Melbourne and Perth. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end as well. So we're hoping to have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So what we'd like you to do is put your Q&A, any questions you have, in the Q&A function of the Zoom platform, and then we'll read those out in the Q&A session to the two presenters. So I'm going to introduce both Kien and Lucy now, so that then we can just flow straight into their presentations. So Dr. Kien Nguyen Trung is a research fellow at Water Sensitive Cities Australia, where he specialises in community-based disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and water resilience research. With 15 years experience in development work across Vietnam and Australia, he has collaborated with major international organisations, including the Australian Water Partnership and UN Women, whilst maintaining active roles as an editor of several academic journals and leading research methodology initiatives in Vietnam. And Dr. Lucy Richardson is a lecturer at the School of Media, Film and Journalism and Deputy Director of the Monash Climate Change Communications Research Hub. Her current research focuses on understanding Australia and international climate change audiences and their responses to messaging and how the media represents topics relating to climate change. Her broader research interests sit in the intersection of environmental science, communication, and social psychology. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Kien Nguyen Trung to do his presentation. Thanks, Kien.
Thank you, Chris. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, all good, Kien.
Thank you, Chris, for introductions. So my name is Kien Nguyen Trung. Today my presentation is on the building water literacy from research to actions. So let me start by a striking fact. Only one third of Australians understand the basic facts like um, stormwaters flow directly into our waterways without treatment, or wastewater and stormwater are carried through different pipes to get to waterways. This highlights the crucial gap in water literacy, which we define as water-related knowledge and behavior. So why does this matter? Water literacy plays a crucial role in building water-sensitive communities, which is one of the three pillars defining a water-sensitive city. Our research shows that when people understand water management issues, they are more likely to feel responsible and adopt water-sensitive behaviors. So the challenge we face is the current literacy levels are low, and many community members find water-related terminology disconnected from their daily lives. So, if urban managers want to engage community members in discussion and more complex issues, they first need to change their approach to engagement and lift basic water literacy levels. So let's start with the project objectives. Our projects rely on the legacy of the Cooperative Research Center for Water Sensitive Cities, which from 2012 and 2021 made significant contributions to transforming urban water management in Australia and globally. So our projects have five objectives. One is building consolidate CRC WSC research. And the second is to identify practical actions that can adopt by agencies. The third objective is to pilot these selective actions and then develop evaluation metrics and finally develop transferable lessons that can be applied across different contexts. So my presentation today is focused on the first objective. So before diving into our findings, let me explain the analytical framework. So our frameworks including four phases. First phase focus on planning. The planning is set the direction and scope of the engagement. Design focus on provide and prepare the materials, including key messages and channel. Implementations focus on inform, involve, collaborate, and empower the community members. Evaluations focus on document the impact of the engagement. So our research is a mixed method in nature. We have four stages. The first one is focused on literature reviews, where we use the documentations to yield 166 raw key findings from the CRC-WSC reports. The second stage is content analysis, where we take our analytical framework to analyze and categorize the findings into 197 broad recommendations in four phases. And the third phase is refining and selecting, where we discuss and choose the most important recommendations and develop a refined list of broad recommendations. The final stage is we develop a draft guide, including 33 implementable recommendations for pilots. So let's start with the implementations, planning. So planning is focused on knowing your audience. So one of the key importance of this process is that we focus on understanding who are we engaging with. So there are several key demographic factors that need attention. Educations, that is strongly related to the water knowledge. Age also plays a role too. We found that the older residents often show higher literacy. Cultural background is crucial because language barriers and varied cultural experiences significantly impact understanding. And interestingly, that we found that practical factors like gardens ownership and length of residence also affect the way people engaged. So the key takeaway here is that we understand that one size does not fit all. We need to tailor our approach to different community segments. The second stage is designing, where we focus on understand the language. So the crucial here is that the language used often create barriers rather than bridges. Industry terms like potable water, fit for purpose might be precise, but they often alienate community members. The solution is use simple, familiar alternatives. So we avoid the jargons. Instead of potable water, say drinking water. Instead of alternative water sources, specify recycled water or rainwater. These small changes can make a big difference in comprehension and engagement. So implementations, we focus on deliver the commission in the visual way. Use a local language, local image, especially though featuring community members are key. So we move away from traditional talking heads approaches and embrace more dynamic visual methods of communications. Another crucial finding is the importance of using multiple channels, from utility bills to social media. Different community segments prefer different communication channels. So the most important key message here is you mix up approaches to reach your audience. The final phase is the evolution phase, where we focus on using dynamics, diverse mix of indicators. Process indicators focus on risk and representation. Implement immediate outcomes like change in awareness. Intermediate outcomes focus on change in behaviors, and long-term impacts focus on water quality improvement, environmental stewardship. So the key takeaways here is that we need to develop an early M&E framework to guide the data collection for evaluation purposes. So to conclude, improved water literacy is crucial for building water sensitive cities, but it requires strategic and evidence-based approach. So what is the practical actions that are implementable for water managers across Australia? Now to answer these questions, I invite my colleague, Dr. Lucy Richardson, to share the result of the two pilots we did to test the practical actions. Thank you for your attention, and happy to take any question in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Kian. That's great. While Lucy's loading up her presentation, can I just remind people to put any questions you might have in the Q&A function. You might not be able to see that on your toolbar at the bottom, but under the more three dots, if you click on that, you'll see a Q&A function, and then you can just type your questions in there. And it's great if you can put it in that section. We'll be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A. So over to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. Hi, everybody. I'm coming to you today from Melbourne, on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about some pilots that we ran in Boorloo, Perth and in Melbourne, looking at ways to test recommendations that Kian has just introduced to us. First, just highlighting again, as Chris mentioned, we did work co-designing these pilots with a range of partners in both Western Australia, so Perth, and in Melbourne, including state government departments, water utilities, associations, etc. It was collaboratively designed and implemented. Because the purpose of the pilots was to test and feed insights back into those guideline recommendations, the presentation I'm going to give does kind of use that framework as the backbone to the presentation. I'll go through very, very briefly how the recommendations were integrated into the designs. I'll go through the approaches, introduce some of the evaluation results that we had, and then what the implications are from these pilots for those guidelines. When it comes to the recommendations, we weren't able to test every single recommendation, and you'll probably find that if you are implementing a pilot, you're not going to have every recommendation relevant for every single activity, but we were able to test quite a few of them. In particular, understanding our audiences, so what are their literacy, interests, experiences, etc. Having clear goals, so which knowledge gaps are we trying to test, what outcomes are we trying to achieve. Looking at the starting points, the constraints that people are under, what hooks or what sorts of factors would be most engaging for their audiences, and tailoring our messages and imagery to match that. Using local visuals, and I'll give you some examples of those in a little bit, thinking about our framing and how that relates to people's identity and values, and the kinds of benefits that they might be interested in. Looking at the cultural sensitivities and how we can best align with those, which channels we can focus on, and which sources are seen as credible. Looking at the personal benefits that we can tie into, and new angles for thinking about the issue of water when we're crafting our messages, and how we evaluate that. So starting out with a clearly defined evaluation plan from the start, we can look at the effectiveness of the processes, channels, and outcomes along the way. In terms of the approaches that we used, we did use a collaborative design, as I've mentioned. We integrated information from earlier research, so from the previous work that Kian mentioned. We looked at planning documents for those different regions and what kinds of goals that were already in place for relating to literacy. And then we also had the interests of the different, so the water utilities and state governments, and where they'd found from their interactions with communities as to where the priorities were. And then we collaboratively designed the messaging, the focus, and the images across multiple iterations to come up with our eventual materials. We tested messages through email and through social media, and we also ran experimental surveys, looked at website and social media metrics, excuse me, through that. In Perth, we actually did experimental surveys across multiple waves. So in our initial survey, we had control and a treatment group, and we tested the messaging in terms of their immediate effect on people's understanding and interests, etc. And then we had a follow-up survey around about 3 weeks later, so that we could actually look at some of the longevity aspects around the effects that we'd found. And in Melbourne, we just had the one wave where we tested the immediate impacts, of the tested metrics, messages. Here you can see just some examples of the kinds of imagery we included in Perth. So in each of the pilots, we included messaging related to specific contexts within the community, and we tailored the images and the messages to the local context. So from the colour choices to the shape of the vegetation to the fauna that were included, and the types of focus topics. Here you can see the hero image, or the overarching master image for Perth, bringing in that water for wellbeing framework. So thinking about what does water, how does water help maintain Perth's trees, sports grounds, parks, etc., to keep them as safe and enjoyable places to exercise, play, socialise, learn, relax, etc., etc. And then each of those contexts had their own image with their own messaging. And you can see here we were tying into the different values that the community have around these places, the kinds of activities they do, trying to tie these messages into people's everyday lives and the kinds of things that they value, and the way that water and the associated vegetation that water and species that water is supporting, to help keep our lives enjoyable and sustainable into the future. Here we have the Melbourne examples, and you can see very different colour palette, very different in terms of the types of vegetation. Activities were somewhat similar. Here you can see an example from the urban centres context, where we were showcasing how water and vegetation play into keeping these places healthy and livable, talking in particular about things like urban heat island and how these factors can help keep the areas cooler. Is an example of an animation that we developed from those specifically to share through social media as a way of engaging audiences through something a bit more interesting in that social media space. Just short animations that we created to bring those messages into focus. In terms of the actual effects that we've seen, this shows here baseline importance. So for each of the surveys, we asked people at the start how important they think the issue was, how important it was for people in their city to understand that the role that water plays in keeping the city healthy and a great place to live. We chose that wording because we suspected that the concept of well-being probably wasn't well understood. And so by breaking it down into that health and being a great place to live, we were trying to bypass that and keep the messages simple. And you can see that in both cities, they thought it was actually very important that people understand this aspect of water. In terms of issue interest, there were differences across the cities, but they were generally finding it to be an important topic. In Perth, it was seen slightly more important than it was in Melbourne. In terms of people's self-reported knowledge, we did see an impact here of the treatment, so exposure to the messages in both Perth and Melbourne, excuse me. And you can see that in comparison to the control groups, in Perth, the control and treatment groups were somewhat similar. In Melbourne, the way that people were recruited was slightly different to the way it was in Perth. In Melbourne, they were recruited directly through email from the utility organisation. And so South East Water's customers were receiving emails and they self-selected, as opposed to Perth, where we actually sampled the wider population through a survey panel company. So the audiences were slightly different in that respect. And we saw a slightly larger effect from treatment in Melbourne. But both showed improvements from exposure to the messaging. In Perth, where we had the follow-up, you can see here that there was a slightly different after a period of time. The group that had been exposed did have a bit of a slight reduction there, but because of the breadth of responses, the error bars you can see here on those charts shows that it was a bit more variability after the fact. And so in terms of self-report, it was harder to gauge whether or not there was longevity in that sample. If we look at their objective measures, you can see here that there was a bit of a drop-off. After 3 weeks, the message that treatment effect was reduced somewhat over time, which reinforces the need for repeated exposure to the messaging, which we weren't able to do through these pilots due to the timeframes involved. Excuse me, but there was a strong treatment effect in both cities. You can also see that for these particular messages in Melbourne, the baseline literacy was actually lower for the messages in Melbourne in comparison to the baseline messaging in Perth. Looking at how this varied across questions, so Likert scale responses here, you can see they incorporated the measure of confidence. So the responses ranged from a definitely true to a definitely false, where in these charts, 5 is the most confident correct response in this regard. And you can see that across the different message topics, the baseline understanding was different. And so it would have been particularly helpful for us in these pilots to actually have a strong understanding of people's baseline literacy before we ran the pilots. But we weren't able to do that based on the timelines involved, etc. But it would have been great to know that before we started the design process, because we could have reduced our focus on some of these topics and actually focused more on the ones which had lower literacy. And you can see here some of the biggest gains that we had were actually in areas such as the driveway permeability. People didn't actually understand that that you could incorporate permeable driveway surfaces. So in terms of the phrasing, we didn't use the word permeable, of course, but we talked about driveway surfaces that can let rain soak through into the ground. And so people weren't actually aware of the role that could play in increasing soil moisture for nearby plants and to keep reducing stormwater and for keeping areas cool, etc. So there were differences across these that were particularly valuable in terms of increasing community literacy. In terms of questions that were asked in both cities, you can see that we did actually have slightly different levels of baseline understanding between Melbourne and Perth. And some of these, the ones that were less well known, were actually less well known for both. So similar patterns of understanding, of baseline understanding, but we did see slightly larger treatment effects in Melbourne in comparison to Perth. We also tested people's levels of interest in comparison to their literacy. And so this was in Melbourne. And interestingly enough, the interest that had the greatest significance was actually people who said they enjoyed visiting parks, wetlands, waterways, or bushlands, tended to have higher baseline literacy in pretty much all of the issues that we looked at in comparison to people who don't enjoy necessarily spending time in these environments. So that was actually a really interesting and potentially quite useful thing to know in terms of how we engage with the community. People who were interested in, who enjoy watching or participating in outdoor sports were also more likely to they had a stronger baseline understanding of recycled water and how that, which were the best uses of recycled water. In terms of age, we actually found that younger people tended to find more new information in the materials and messages that we provided in comparison to older people. Focus groups that were run by Metrics Consulting in Perth actually found the reverse. So in the participants of those focus groups, the younger people actually said they found younger people said they found more. I know I'm confusing myself. In contrast to the focus groups, where younger people said they actually understood some of the information more already in comparison to what the survey found. That highlights something which I'll come back to later about the respective value of the two different types of message testing, so through survey and through focus groups, and the roles they can play in formative evaluation, etc. In terms of the preferred channels, we also asked this in both areas, and we did find significant differences in the channel preferences in the two cities. However, the highest preference was still through the water utilities in both through their bills or newsletters, etc. Television, again, was relatively up there. Local councils in particular through their newsletters, etc., were also highly valued. Social media was much less valued in Melbourne in comparison to Perth. So that's one that is quite interesting. Browsing the internet, again, much less interest in Melbourne in comparison to Perth. So understanding this before a campaign rolls out is actually really, really valuable knowledge, so that you can pick the most effective approaches for reaching people in each locality. We did get suggested improvements through those focus groups. So the focus groups did actually present the materials from the pilots and gain insights from them. people didn't actually understand the connections between water and well-being, but the messaging resonated a bit more with younger people in comparison to older people. People were actually also looking for a call to action. So they were kind of wanted to know, what are you expecting us to do from this? And so while our messaging was focusing on building literacy, recognizing that people are expecting a call to action, expecting, what do I do with this kind of information, is also important to know. Even if your focus is on literacy, making it clear what the purpose is really valuable in terms of meeting people's expectations and helping them understand how it fits in the scheme of things. The visuals were seen as engaging and locally relevant, but more so again for younger than older participants. Utility providers were also seen as relevant to lead campaigns and local governments. So in this regard, the focus groups and the survey responses did align. And again, small chunks of messages are preferred, such as through social media. And so the focus groups being run in Perth, that does resonate with what was found in the survey, but may not be as appropriate in Melbourne. Location-specific posters and banners were an interesting one that was mentioned at the focus groups that we didn't actually test in the survey. So putting up posters at sports grounds, for example, might be a really interesting way to engage with that particular audience to raise their awareness in that regard. Jumping then back to those recommendations and what our findings mean for that. In terms of the planning stage, focus groups are really valuable for pre-testing messages and the resonance of those messages, because they can give you that qualitative insights and allow you to delve a bit more into why people say what they say and what they think could be done better. Surveys, though, are really valuable in terms of establishing baseline understandings of the audience's knowledge and their interests. So being able to pair both of those at the start, so running a survey at some point to know where to focus on, which literacy aspects to focus on, particularly important if you're introducing a new aspect to water literacy beyond the traditional focus, as we did by bringing in that wellbeing angle. Having that baseline knowledge through surveys is really valuable. And then once you're developed some messaging, being able to test that through focus groups is also valuable to make sure that they are achieving the best outcomes they can. So slightly different purposes and findings through each, because the focus groups use a small number of people. You can have diverse range of people giving you diverse input, but it doesn't necessarily represent the wider community. And so that's where surveys can be really good to establish the broader levels of baseline. And so pairing the two can be particularly valuable at that planning stage. In designing, again, those focus groups are really good for improving design before they get rolled out. Having attractive visuals and linking those into the local context, so having local vegetation, representing the local diversity of people and their interests is really valuable. Messages need to have that strong basis in those audiences and their levels of conceptual understanding, and how they being able to connect the message in with their own understandings of the way the world works is really valuable. Having those short snippets and interest-based messages is quite preferable, and being able to have those location-specific interests, understand those, and to be able to tap into those location-based communication as well is another option for that design. In terms of implementation, the pilot's short timeframes made it very challenging to test some of the recommendations, but it does reinforce the value of those because of the challenges that we faced. Really highlights being able to have longer timeframes is really crucial to be able to tap into some of those channel options. So, for example, the utility organisations do have they plan their campaigns well in advance, and so being able to tap into that planning process to be able to schedule campaigns, especially if you're wanting to have repeated messages and to have multiple organisations. So, for example, water utilities and local governments parallel implementation of delivery of the messages. Having those longer timeframes is critical to be able to align those delivery mechanisms. And having the different channels preferred by different audiences allows for greater reach and more repetition throughout that implementation. In terms of evaluation, as I've already mentioned, having those formative evaluations, so during that planning and design process, to make sure we capture those critical messages and have those really well-crafted designs is crucial to highly effective campaigns. And being able to evaluate the effectiveness of different channels and messages allows for tweaking the campaign delivery, particularly where you've got the option of multiple time points. So having that repetition, being able to capture those insights as you go, being able to track those web metrics and interactions and social media interactions, for example, gives you a great way to refine your approach throughout a campaign, and also to inform future campaigns of which of those channels tend to reach which audiences for which purposes and on which types of messaging can provide that ongoing insights over time. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Thanks, Lucy. Just while I quickly share. Oops. So just a reminder to put any questions that you've got in the Q&A function. That would be much appreciated. And apologies, I've got too many windows open. Okay, so just to sum up the presentation from both Kian and Lucy, essentially we heard from Kian talking about synthesizing all the research that had been done by the CRC for water sensitive cities, as well as many other organisations over the years, into 33 recommendations across those 4 phases that you heard from both Kian and Lucy. And then you heard from Lucy talking about how we tested out in 2 pilots against those 33 recommendations, or a subset of those 33 recommendations. And essentially we heard that the message was clear, effective, and important. Retention remains a bit of an issue, given some of the constraints that Lucy alluded to as well. Baseline knowledge and understanding of new concepts was lower than expected, not low, but lower than expected, I guess. But there was also some reasons for that as well that Lucy outlined. Literacy was generally higher and was enhanced in both pilots generally across the board. We had some lessons learned about more time being required in the planning and design phases. Multi-sector and multi-jurisdiction involvement in the design and delivery approach is also important. Message repetition and diversity of channels is essential. It leads into a comms campaign philosophy, I guess. And just to round off the content that we're delivering this morning, the next steps for us now will be to take those recommendations that Lucy went through and refine anything we need to do with the 33 recommendations in the guideline based on those pilot results. And then we'll be completing more detailed data analysis, finalising some of the lessons learned process, and then, of course, finishing off with some reporting. We will aiming to have that all finished early in 2025, and all the information, reports and everything like that will be on our Water Sensitive Cities Australia website. I put the link to our project page in the chat, so that as well. So now we're at the point, just move along to the Q&A session. So now we're at the point of some questions for our 2 presenters. So I'm going to start with reading out. We've got three or four questions in there at the moment. I'm going to start with the first question. Did you test messages in different languages? If so, did you capture any metrics on differences in response acceptance of messages beyond the target groups? That's probably one for Lucy, I think.
Yeah. We didn't actually test that. All the messages were tested in English. So in that regard, we didn't have differences to assess there.
No worries. Why do you think people's knowledge about the role of water in Perth decreased post-treatment? Do you have any recommendations to improve messages about this topic? Lucy?
Yeah. My thought is that it's mostly to do with remembering. People don't remember things particularly well. And that was why we were saying that repetition, you need to hear something multiple times for it to actually stick well. It wasn't that it completely disappeared. It didn't really go right back to the pre-treatment levels, but it did drop a little bit. And it may just be, and my thoughts are that it is just to do with memory. And once people had encountered those messages a couple of times, it would be much more likely to stick.
Thanks, Lucy. Here's a really topical question. Many organisations have very tight budgets at the moment. Do you have any advice on how organisations can make the most of their available funds for example, through collaboration or prioritisation of channels or anything else?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things here is that multiple organisations with tight budgets means more budget, if that makes sense. So in terms of collaboration, if you can have multiple groups contributing and delivering, then you've actually got much more chance to have these messages out. And our pilots, if you're sending them through materials and channels that are already being run and operated by these organisations, as opposed to paid advertising or those kinds of things, then you can potentially do it for a lower cost. When we designed these messages and materials, we specifically designed them in a way that they could allow for multiple uses with multiple hooks, if that makes sense. So that's why we had those different contexts. So you could tie into people who were interested in the sports, had sports interests. We could tap into people with parks interests, people who were gardeners at home. So we gave those different contexts so that you could basically run multiple campaigns or multiple angles without having to go back to scratch and spend more money designing new things. So that was why we designed them the way they were, hoping that they could be reused over time in multiple ways without having to reinvest more money, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think my main recommendation is to have multiple partners working on them together.
Makes sense. Thanks, Lucy. So I've got a question for Kian. Kian, we'd be interested in your initial thoughts on now that you've seen the report, the pilot outcomes. How do you see any changes that might be needed for the recommendations in your guideline?
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, that really thoughtful questions and will require thoughtful consideration. I think one of the key things that I like from the presentation of Lucy is that we have to consider the different time frames that water managers have and also different time frame that their audience have. So when we implement those communications strategies, we need to consider those time frames. And one of the key things is that we cannot do everything. So we have to prioritize. And I think that understand the population segments is important. So have your priority put on the specific segments is for each of the campaigns is important. So I think that is one of the key things that I take away from Lucy's presentation.
Thanks, Kian. Here's a question for both presenters. I have let's see, how can we advocate for increased support from the WA government for groundwater recharge, especially given the worsening projections from climate change in the way of improving water literacy? Maybe Lucy, you might want to go first.
Yeah, so I'm happy to. Well, one of the things that we did find in the Perth study, let me just. One of the questions that we did ask was around. So one of the messages we had in Perth was around groundwater being affected by climate change, and we found that that was an area where the literacy could be improved. So there is a gap there, and you could at least have an evidence base now that shows the community needs to understand this better, particularly if you want them to join in conversations around policy. So if that's helpful, this report might be quite useful there. Happy to share that with you.
And one thing that comes to mind for me is your audience. Where does the audience get their information relating to groundwater from? Is it Water Corporation in WA? Is it one of the state government departments? Is it somewhere else? So needing to understand where your audience gets their information from is important too. Ian, is there anything you'd like to add to that question?
I think you both already stated those my thoughts, so probably I have no more comments.
No worries. There's a question for you again, Kian, here. Do you think there's a clear linear link between success in raising awareness through to having sustained behaviour change? Or is it more complex, and what are the implications for literacy campaigns?
Thank you for that. I think that people often see that think that we need to have a awareness change to be able to have the behavior change related to the water sensitive um, uh, knowledge and behaviors, but that's not necessary too. In reality, there's more complex to the relationship between awareness, perception, and behaviors. And often that when people do something well, they are likely to change their behaviors. So there's a theory saying that the difference when you have experienced the dissonance between your awareness and behaviors, you likely to change your awareness to align with your behaviors. So one of the key things that if we can do is that if we can do a lot of experiment to have people take some initial change in their behavior, even if it's really short term, they can have change their awareness in the long term. So that is one of the things. And in our literature review, we also see that there's a strong link between the both components in helping elaborate and leverage the water literacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Kian.
Can I add to that, Chris?
Sure.
Yeah. Also recognizing that having that awareness or understanding also doesn't necessarily guarantee behavior change, because there are so many other factors that influence behavior. Situational, availability, all sorts of different aspects, resourcing, etc.
Thanks, Lucy. Lucy, a question for you. In developing the pilots and testing against the framework, we heard from you there was some things that we learnt through the time about better understanding of baseline recruitment strategies, channels, etc., etc. At a high level, what would you do differently if you were starting again 9 months ago? I think it was. Let's just say.
I think I would have. I guess it depends on whether or not we had longer to do it. If we'd had longer to do it, I definitely would have built in more time to ensure we could get the diversity of channels and delivery organisations able to actually share the messages so that we could hit a broader audience and integrate more message repetition. That would probably have been the key thing, achieving more channels to get that broader reach. And so you need the time to actually allow those organisations to build it into their strategies.
Great, thank you. I don't see any further questions in the Q&A function or in the chat, unless I've missed anything. So what we might do, given that we've got 5 minutes or so, if people want to put their hand up, we might take some questions from the floor for 5 minutes. If there's any questions from the floor.
I think Helen has just raised her hand.
Oh, sorry, I was looking for the virtual hand. Sorry, Helen. Go right ahead. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Hi, I'm from the Maribyrnong River and Waterways Association, and we're to the west of Melbourne. And we've been engaging with the local communities in the upper catchment and Greater Western Water and Melbourne Water through a think tank process based around the fact that Greater Western Water was doing a pricing submission and they needed the community to be involved in it. But we found that the questions they had and we had were totally different. So in the end, we then worked out a process by which the first thing we did was get people to send in their questions to us that they wanted to know. And then we linked that with special guest speakers who could explain what different corporations had responsibility for. Everybody loved it. It shifted the understanding of how dramatic climate change is affecting the water cycle. And we finished up with the problem that there's two issues for us: understanding the water cycle in different scenarios, because the upper think tank is peri-urban, the lower part, we're starting on the lower think tank tomorrow, is all urbanised. But no one had realised that the west of Melbourne, we are groundwater dependent ecosystems. So this fundamental fact, that's where we get our base flows. And yet this is so poorly understood, right? And this is a catchment that has been known since 2006 that it needs an extra 7 gigalitres of water a year. And nobody's moved on it yet, though we're doing more flow studies at the moment. We've just put in a submission explaining how we think that can be achieved. And we're primarily saying we need base flows, because if we don't have base flows to support the species, we don't have a creek that's running. How will people ever relate to their local environment if they've got a dry creek bed, which is what the future could be, because we've lost 25% of our water. We're going to lose another 40 to 60, another 20 to 40%. And with urbanisation, we're not getting groundwater infiltration. So I need help on getting people to understand the huge importance of groundwater and where we can have infiltration in the system. But if I don't have the people out there, in the ordinary people, understanding this and clamouring for it, I'll never get the investment in a time when everybody's budget's restrained because of COVID expenses, right? So we're working with groups, but groundwater seems to be the biggest. It's the thing that worries me the most, how we're going to get that understanding. So, I mean, years ago in school, we had a salt watch program running, and we got kids to understand it through, having the tank and the gravel and things like that. But that's not going to be good enough here. So if there's any advice you could give me on how you can message groundwater, or if anybody wants to work with me on how to do that, I'd be very grateful. I mean, tomorrow we're just taking urban people to a constructed wetland in a park, because we think letting them understand how that's capturing stormwater and that's helping to keep the park cool and irrigated and clean the water but
I think,
so I better
yeah,
keep quiet, but I just need help.
no, that's right. Clearly heard, and I think there's a couple of things that come to mind for me. There's definitely some lessons that can be learned from the work that Lucy's done. So I know Lucy and you will catch up post this session some way. But there's also some lessons learned from around the topic of groundwater dependency, because Perth is groundwater dependent as well. So there's some, albeit there'll be some different contextual factors there, but there's some, at a high level, there's some learnings there, I'd imagine too. So Lucy, is there anything you'd just like to add to that?
Nothing specifically, but yeah, definitely happy to have a chat after. Helen, yeah, just reach out.
Yeah, I was just so lovely to hear that Perth was worried about it too. And of course, it's the west of Melbourne. We've got sodic soil, so you can't always infiltrate through them. We've got to go and find, and it's only in the upper catchment that we've got the kind of soils where we can do infiltration. And we have this huge surplus of recycled water, which is of a very poor quality because it hasn't got the contaminant, the emerging contaminants to its high levels of nutrients. So it's a big issue for us.
Thanks for that. You've heard that for sure. So is there anyone else in the audience that like one last question before we close out the session? Doesn't look like there is any further questions.
Chris, Ben here. Just yep. Acknowledging that we've received 2 questions on today, one via the Q&A and one via the chat about culturally and linguistically diverse communities. I think this is something we hear that, and I think when we do the guidelines, that'll be something that we make sure that we address in the outputs of the project. So thank you for the questions and the feedback on that important issue.
Thanks, Ben. So in the interest of time, we might wrap up the Q&A session there. We will have the recording for this webinar plus the slide decks in PDF form available on the Zoom platform in the coming days. So just keep an eye out for that. You'll get alerted by email, I suspect. So the other thing is, this is the last webinar for this calendar year, but we'll be kickstarting again in February in 2025. So you can use that QR code to check out what webinars we'll be running in 2025 in due course. So to close out, I'd like to thank Lucy and Kien for their presentations. I'd like to thank the support team in the background for helping to set up this webinar and help me run it. And I'd also like to thank all the attendees today. I hope you all got something really useful out of the session. So thank you, and I wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.